Thank you all so much for being here. We know it is midday on Sunday, and it is also kind of in the midst of all this transition on campus. So thank you all for taking the time to join us. We're really excited to have you here. We will go ahead and get started. And we are going to be thinking a little bit this afternoon about ableism, accessibility, and rethinking notions of norm.
All right, so in the presentation, we will in the session, we'll introduce ourselves. We'll talk a little bit about what is ableism. And then we'll kind of define ability as a social construction. After that, we'll briefly consider the historical lineage of normalcy. What is ability and able-bodiedness? Some examples of ableism in action. We'll look at the social versus the medical model of disability. And then we'll offer just some small suggestions for increasing accessibility and being less ableist in our daily lives. And then we'll leave some time for questions and comments.
In the interest of time, we will introduce ourselves to you. We normally would like to know who else is sharing space. So if you would like to, feel free to share who you are, what brought you to this session, why you were interested, or anything else you would like to share. Also, this session is being recorded in an effort to increase accessibility. That being said, we recognize that might make it feel less comfortable for some folks, so feel free to turn off your camera, change your name if you would prefer that not show up in the recording, or de-identify yourselves in any ways that feel best and comfortable. Hi, I'm Sara, happy to be joining you today. I am in the education department here at Springfield College, and I teach in the area around special education. I'm an informer, inclusive special educator, so I co-taught full day in a classroom with a general ed teacher. I'm originally from Vermont. I love to be outside. I'm also at home with lots of dogs who are up, so if you hear any noises, that would be why. Yeah.
All right, I was letting people in. I'm Brianna. I am adjuncting in the education department at Springfield. I'm also the coordinator of an inclusive higher ed program at MassArt. It's just getting going, so that's exciting. I am from Colorado, so love the mountains, also love being outdoors. And so yeah, I'm excited to be here today.
Awesome.
Okay, so if we think of ableism, just looking at definitions, so the Oxford Dictionary defines it as discrimination in favor of able-bodied people. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines it as discrimination or prejudice against individuals with disabilities. So if you wouldn't mind in the chat, just kind of briefly telling us what you notice about this definition. What does it mean? What are you wondering about? So far we have definition one is body specific. We have favor versus prejudice. Both imply ability as the norm. Emphasizes disability, but does not say specifics. Discrimination is a big theme, right? So these are all great like observations, right? The both definitions, while being very specific or vague, also both make the assumption that disability is like a fixed and real thing, right? So it doesn't talk at all about disability. It just defines disability as kind of a fixed and real thing. And it's very vague. So we're going to kind of, for one, pick apart the idea of disability as a fixed and real thing, because in order to understand ableism, you have to understand what disability is. And so we're going to make the argument that we need to be able to see disability first for what it is before we can kind of unpack ableism. Yeah, so now we're going to focus a little bit on thinking about ability as a social construct. So we're going to kind of complicate what the definitions take for granted, which is disability as like a fixed thing. So we're going to kind of think of now ability as a social construct.
So we could spend an entire presentation, an entire course, an entire year thinking about all the ways in which sort of notions of ability and normal have been constructed socially through across history. So we just wanted to kind of talk very briefly about some of the examples of ways in which perceptions of ability or normalcy have been used in really specific and oppressive ways historically. So of course, right, if we think about slavery, right, justification of slavery as sort of less able, right, inferiority for BIPOC people compared to folks of European ancestry. There's a long history of institutionalizing folks in our country, right, around the idea of normalcy, right, who's on the margins, and that had a very expansive and changing definition all across different times and spaces of history. But it could include basically anyone who was, you know, not seen as normal. So folks with perceived disabilities, poor Americans, right, unemployed, people who are experiencing addiction, mental health conditions, all sorts of different folks were institutionalized in different ways to kind of remove them from the visible mainframe, right, of American culture. There was the eugenics movement where, right, there was the idea of kind of creating that best race, which was, of course, white, Judeo-Christian, folks from middle and upper class backgrounds. And there was even fitter family competitions. When we were doing some research for this, we found the fitter family competitions right here at the Eastern, Eastern Expo, right? So there's all these pictures of the fitter families, which were all, of course, you know, white, lots of children, specific clothing to kind of signify certain means. So we really worked on kind of creating whiteness and all sorts of other things as the ideal and desired human. Of course, civil rights across history, who can own property, who can vote, who can make their own decisions. And so, right, a longtime white Christian men of certain financial means were who had civil rights. We saw, of course, across the Holocaust, kind of notions of ability and normalcy, and of course also ties into eugenics. But there was the T4 program, right? So the least human of the humans were folks with disabilities for experimentation. And sort of across time and spaces, there's been major discrepancies in employment opportunities, wages, high school graduation rates for disabled Americans, which is very much real and alive now. There is still a separate wage, which is like around $4, I believe, currently. So if you're disabled, you can get paid far less than minimum wage. There are still huge employment gaps, graduation gaps. So this is the very limited tip of the iceberg conversation that we apologize for keeping so brief, but just some kind of a start of how sort of normal and ability have been co-constructed across different times and places within history.
So there are like whole doctorate programs on the history of normalcy, right, and how it was created. But what is important here is that disability is very subjective, and basically, if you don't appear or fall into what is deemed normal by society, right, in any of these categories, you could be labeled as having a disability. So being able to complete academic tasks and share knowledge in traditional ways, right? So reading and writing and math competition, if you can't share your knowledge in traditional ways, you may be deemed as having a disability. Behaving in socially normed ways at all times under all circumstances, right? And recognizing what normed ways are, right? So ways of being that are white, heteronormative, right? All of these things. If you can't function in those ways in all settings, you might be labeled as having a disability. And having a body that works in normal ways, right? So ambulatory and able to see, hear, talk, all functioning, and we use properly in quotes, right? But anything that you are deemed outside of normal, it could be labeled as having a disability, no matter what the reasoning, right, is behind it. It can be not about disability at all. It might just be a different way of being. It might be that you're from a different culture. You value different things. It could be anything, but any and all of these could be lumped into, and often do get lumped into, disability.
So we are going to sort of revisit ableism, and this was another definition that we liked sort of more than the first couple that we were looking at. So this one says, ableism is the discrimination of and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. At its heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require fixing and defines people by their disability. Like racism and sexism, ableism classified entire groups of people as less than and includes harmful stereotypes, misconceptions, and generalizations of people with disabilities. As Dr. Logan noted in the chat earlier, right, those initial definitions didn't at all consider sort of the structural and social construction of disability. And so sort of as we move forward within this conversation, we are thinking about ableism as really being socially constructed, right, in ways that have labeled certain ways of being and knowing and doing as preferred and normed. And so kind of not being able to participate and engage in those ways is a large part of what disability becomes. And so we'll use that as we continue moving forward. So with that, we just feel it's important to kind of restate or say again that ability, right, or being able to function and engage in ways that are deemed normal, right? It's all interwoven with racism, classism, xenophobia, traditional views of behaviorism, sexism, and just in general, our societal views of normalcy. So as Brianna was saying, what gets deemed as having ability or not isn't just a single axis issue, right? It's interwoven with all these other systems of privilege and oppression. So with that, these are again just the very tip of the iceberg, but we have some examples of ableism in action that we're going to talk about next.
Okay, so physical ableism is sometimes more clear than the others, but it's still important to think about and name. So any time buildings are inaccessible or spaces of buildings, right, don't have access for certain folks. Separate entrances, right? So it's it's ableist to have one entrance for maybe people who need to use a ramp and another entrance for people to use the stairs, because you're separating anything that's separate but not equal, right? We have a long history of recognizing the problematic point in separate but not equal. Anytime you have to separate folks to even enter a building, right? That's not ideal. And so choosing an event space that is not accessible, right, for whatever reason, whether it's access, it's financial or whatever, anytime you choose a building or a space that's not accessible. Lack of signs and visuals, right? Assuming where people, assuming that people will know where they're gonna go, or only having signs that have lots of language, written language, right? Signs without buttons, or signs with buttons that don't have braille, right? Lack of consideration around sensory. We often think of physical access as being like, can somebody get into the space? But we don't think about sensory, right? So smells, lighting, easy exit options. Are there options for seating? Things like that. Touching mobility device without consent, right? Anytime you touch somebody's wheelchair, that's ableist, right? Unless you ask them. And these are just tip of the iceberg, right? We were just trying to come up with things that seem straightforward to us, but aren't always straightforward. So language, this is one of the most important, in my opinion, things to think about. So we have listed some ableist language. So special needs, labeling certain people as having special needs, labeling certain needs as special, right? So special needs, saying that's so retarded. Are you off your meds? It's like the blind leading the blind. Wheelchair bound or confined to a wheelchair. My suggestion fell on deaf ears. That's so lame. She's so crazy. Crazy is used a lot, right? That's crazy. The weather's crazy. Things are often just labeled as crazy without thinking about the historical and meaning behind the word and how that's ableist.
Yeah, all microaggressions, absolutely. Okay. We also thought about ableism in terms of attitudes, right? So assuming, right, all disability is visible, right? Assuming that you can see and somehow know something about disability is making ableist assumptions, right? The idea that disability is inspirational. Oftentimes the ways in which disability is framed in the media, in movies, sort of across different media is that, wow, you know, look at that person who has overcome or who has been able to do something despite their disability. So seeing disability as something that is inspirational is really ableist, right? It's just some part of someone's lived experience. They're kind of going through life. That idea that we want to fix, remediate, or cure disability, the idea, right, of disability as deficit, that those folks who do not identify with disability need to come in and fix or cure or take care of for them is ableist at its core. Oftentimes disability is seen as tragic, right? Sometimes there's even language of fate worse than death. You know, I'd rather die than not be able to walk anymore or not be able to see. And all those sort of beliefs about disability as being this tragic, horrific experience, right, are rooted in ableism. There's a lot of infantilization of people with disabilities. So talking to adults in voices like you would to a little child because you're assuming something about maybe IQ, right? Or about how they're able to comprehend. So we have a friend who uses a wheelchair, and when we sometimes go to restaurants, right, the ways that folks in the community talk to that person is very different than how I get spoken to. Norman Coons and Emma Vandercliff, who are disability activists and scholars, always talk about hell-bent on helping. this idea, right, that people with disabilities need help, and this insistence on giving help and not respecting, no, I don't want help, is ableist in sort of its base, right? Speaking for someone with a disability, it's sort of taking that voice or assuming that you know better or can better represent or speak for someone with a disability is also ableist. Sorry. And then other examples we thought about specifically were just the ways in which we still have segregated spaces. So we still live in a world where separate classrooms exist for students with disabilities, separate schools. This idea that disability is reason to remove someone from a space, right? So a lot of folks argue that after Brown versus Board, right, special education, and we could also talk at length about the overrepresentation of students of color within special education, right? But it becomes a new means for segregating and removing students from general education classroom spaces. We see a lot of different recreational opportunities, right? So this idea that we need a separate dance class for people with disabilities. We see camps specific for people with disabilities instead of having accessible options, right, that everyone can attend. We see a lot of separation in athletics, so especially with competitive sports, right, who is allowed to participate and who is kind of segued into these separate things, right? And a lot of times things like separate sports also come with that savior complex, right, idea of like, I'm going to create this great option for you, instead of rethinking how could we make the space that already exists accessible for all folks. We also see, as another example, sheltered workshops where folks are making very small wages, and oftentimes doing tasks on repeat to kind of fill time. So all of this, right, is ableist in thinking we need to remove from and send to this other space because of disability.
So another thing is lack of access, right? So lack of visuals, lack of captioning. Inaccessible language is huge, especially in the academy, right? Using big words without defining them. Hard to navigate websites. Long periods of sitting and attending, right? In general, just any one-size-fits-all approach is lack of access, right? In ableism, and thinking that everybody could easily access this in this one way.
So we're going to talk briefly about sort of two different ways that disability are looked at. So oftentimes there's conversation about the social versus the medical model of disability. And we're going to use two images to kind of talk about them that were created by the Democracy, Disability and Society group, which is out of the UK. Oh, that didn't work well. Sorry that the image is not super clear. So the sort of traditional model of looking at disability is the medical model. And from the medical model perspective, right, all of the problems lie within that individual. So it's kind of their deficiencies that disable them. And, you know, it's all inherent to that person. It is something real and different about them. So, right, from a medical model perspective, we want to name the difference and label it as some sort of impairment or illness or disorder or disability. And then we want to think about sort of how we fix it, right? We want to remediate it. We want to cure it. We want to do something to kind of minimize or get rid of this disability that the person is experiencing. And so it's really kind of a way of looking at it, much like we need to name it and do something about it, because having this disability is something that someone should really not feel good about, right? It's a deficit thing. And so that's kind of how disability is often thought about, right? It is within our schools, right? We have to categorize, label someone with a disability in order for them to access supports and services through special education. In order to kind of have accommodations, right? You have to qualify as having a disability even under the ADA, Section 504, right? So we work in a system where we do name, and we kind of have to name all the deficits that come with that disability in order to qualify for different supports and services. Another way of looking at disability is the social model. And so the social model really looks at it in terms of barriers to access. So sure, someone may experience these particular ways of being and knowing and doing, but what becomes the barrier is instead the inaccessible world and environment around them, not kind of the different ways that that person might engage with the world. And so the social model really considers the ways in which attitudes, right, can create barriers, the ways in which sort of different institutional structures create barriers, the ways in which our socially normed ways of learning and doing all are what create the barriers, and it's no longer about just the person. And so from the social model of disability, the goal is really to minimize barriers to access and to see disability as difference, not as deficit or deviant or some other negative connotation that often comes with it. To really think about how we can change accessibility in spaces to create a more accessible world. So from here, we're going to sort of use a social model lens. Again, these are just some very first round kind of starter suggestions for ways to think about increasing accessibility.
Okay, so in the world of Zoom teaching and virtual, we tried to give some tips in how to be more accessible. So video choice, right, on or off. It is very important to offer the option of having your video on or off, because to assume that people can sit there in ways that they feel comfortable having everybody watch with their video on for an extended amount of time, right, is ableist. In the world of Zoom, right, you're not able to stand up at the back of the room and walk around. You feel uncomfortable stretching if you're feeling, you know, if you're feeling sore or your back is sore and you stretch, you don't want, you know, your body just like out there for the entire class to see. There's things that you have to think about in Zoom that suddenly become an issue that weren't ever before in the physical classroom. I didn't identify at the beginning, but I identify as autistic, and I identify as a self-advocate, and just even trying to get movement in Zoom, it's like you're being looked at, right? So having video choice is really an important accessible option that you can offer students. Option to respond aloud or using the chat, right? We have this ability now in Zoom that we never had in the classroom before, for everybody to share thoughts in multimodal ways that everybody can see. And so that's a great option of increasing accessibility. Use of screen share to add a visual component, right? So not only screen sharing your screen, but allowing others to screen share. I have a student at Mass Art who, when I ask, you know, to answer a question, he always chooses, well, can I just show you? You know, he prefers to just show his work rather than explain it. Choose videos that have the use of closed captioning, right? So either pick videos that have closed captioning or add the closed captioning for folks. Make presentations available to participants to open on their own screen if they prefer, right? So making whatever you have available to students as well. Use whole group and small group, right? Some of these things we deem as good teaching. Also, we need to think about as increasing accessibility, right? So some folks feel much more comfortable engaging in small groups. And then frequent screen breaks, right? We are all on Zoom a really long time, so breaks are sometimes much more necessary on Zoom than they ever were even in person. So physical spaces, think about if you're planning conferences or planning events, even simple things as meeting friends. Think about choosing buildings and rooms that are physically accessible. They either have a ramp or an elevator space. There's enough space for folks who use a variety of accessibility supports, right? So often, we'll get in a classroom and there'll be multiple individuals who use virtual, and there's just not enough space because, you know, why would we think about having, you know, enough space for those? So thinking about those, thinking about buildings, considering route accessibility. So are there sidewalks, curb cuts, crosswalks that have visuals and sounds? Thinking about all of this in the beginning, right? In the planning stages is important. Discouraging the use of scented products. So we don't think about this often, right? But there are times where there are people in rooms that cannot focus or have to physically leave the space because somebody has strongly scented perfumes. I taught with somebody who was very sensitive, and she had an asthma attack when a student was wearing a strongly scented perfume. So asking folks to minimize scented perfumes and things. Consider whether folks will need to use a back door or other mode of access that might feel stigmatizing, right? Thinking about that beforehand and minimizing that. And then asking yourself, if we use this space, who might be left out? So that's a very good thing. Thinking about sensory, we don't have that there, but you know, what does the room look like sensory-wise? Is it very open and big and loud? How could you minimize that? Is it, you know, what kind of lighting is there? Could you ask for other sources of light, etc.? So thinking about all of those things for physical access as well is important.
So we also thought a little bit about sort of academic, more teaching and learning suggestions. So, you know, things to think about are multiple ways to engage with and take in content. So oftentimes, right, we rely on the reading, the writing, but how else can we include visuals and listening and hands-on stuff and creating, right, to engage with learning and thinking. Also thinking along the same lines, right, creating multiple ways that learners can show their thinking and their learning. So often sort of academics becomes, you know, you'll read something and you'll write about it, or you'll read something or do something and solve this, right? Or you'll do a science experiment and then you'll write in this particular format, which there are certainly, right, times and spaces where writing or specific skills are really important and necessary. But when we don't multiple ways to show knowledge, who are we leaving out in terms of they've got it and then, right, their thinking kind of fell apart in the one specific way we asked them to do the task. So thinking more expansively about how we can show what we've learned or what we think or what we know. Another really basic thing, but making sure to use screen reader accessible documents. So often we're sharing PDFs or other formats, right? And they're not OCR'd so that they can be read by a screen reader, which means now someone has a digital text, which is great, but if they rely on screen reader capabilities for a whole variety of reasons, they still can't access the document. Another thing that often happens is that in an attempt to be inclusive, we think that that means lowering expectations, right? But really having high expectations for all learners and building in those supports to help them be successful is part of being anti-ableist. So not having lessened expectations for someone, but saying, I think that you're super, you know, capable and I'm gonna help figure out ways to do this because I know you can. And in general, just sort of rethinking what smartness or school appropriate behavior can look like, because so often what it really becomes is, can we do things in specific ways or can we engage in specific ways? And if we can do those things, then we can be quote unquote successful, right, in academic spaces. And so sort of just rethinking sort of this idea of smartness and how we engage with school, right, will help lead to more accessible spaces. In terms of sort of socially, right, we would think about reframing disability as difference, right? So it seems really basic, but so often it's thought of as a deficit, as someone being less than or unable to do particular things, instead of this person has a different way of engaging, right, with these particular things. So rethinking disability is really important to move towards a more anti-ableist perspective. Another thing that seems really simple, but getting to know others before making assumptions, right? What might come off as weird, right? That's so weird, they're so weird, might just really be a difference in how someone talks or engages with others or moves, or they might need to get familiar before they can really let you know their true self, right? So really taking some time before those assumptions come into play. Asking those around you if they want help. So often I'm going to go help, or I'm going to, do this to help someone, but don't assume that folks need help or provide help without consent is really important. Even things like running to open a door for someone, right, seems really nice, but it can also be super infantilizing or, just really not a good experience for someone. The assumption, right, that you had to come in and help them. So also there's a lot of stereotypes about specific disability categories kind of being antisocial, and don't buy into those, right? So often in particular, I'm thinking of students with autism, but a lot of the narratives of autistic people say, I really want friends. I need some support in figuring out how to make them, right? So and there's all sorts of other stereotypes around disability, but don't buy into stereotypes, right? And also just keep asking yourselves, do I have friends that identify as disabled? And if not, what biases are you carrying, and how can you start to work to unpack that?
Okay, so in general, we just kind of came up with a few things to remember and think about. So be careful about the language that you use, right? Be cognizant of what language you're using and what that means. So retarded, idiot, moron, deaf, dumb, crazy, psychotic, all of those and so on, right? All have historical negative connotations connected to perceptions of disability. Reframe special needs, right? So we all have special needs. The disability community rejects this concept. So it is no longer the acceptable language to say special needs when regarding disability. And so try to reframe that. Respect language choices, right? So person first language is often pushed by non-disabled people, but identity first language is often preferred for folks who identify as disabled. So it's often taught that you should always use person first language, but in using person first language, you can erase somebody's identity, right? So I identify as autistic, and so that is identity first. Whereas other people may prefer still person first. So just asking, right? But don't assume. And then,
should we say that, so the example, right, autistic, identify as autistic would be identity first language. So identifying with autistic, right, as part of identity, versus oftentimes you hear people say, you need to say a person with autism. So the idea behind person first language is kind of saying someone's not just their disability. So they're a person with, right, they're a person with a vision impairment, right? A person with autism. And so this is a high area of debate because oftentimes someone will say, I'm a disabled individual, right? And someone else will say, who does not identify in that way, no, you're a person with a disability. I mean, I see it all the time. So really being cognizant of individual language choices.
And centering accessibility and access for all, right? If there is one option for anything, you're likely leaving folks out. So choices and having options, it increases accessibility and is in line with anti-ableist ways of being. And then remember that disability is not a standalone category. So don't erase other components of someone's identity. Sarah, I think you have a great example of this from your research.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So first I saw there was a hand raised.
It was me. And, I wanted to ask a question in terms of respect to language and first person language. So I remember working with an individual who kind of schooled me about first person language around this, and the conversation about many times people say, you know, I'm a wheelchair user versus identifying as a person using, oh, let me see how, now I'm messing it up here, but I remember being schooled on either a person in a wheel. He was saying to me, oh my gosh, now I'm sorry, I'm messing this up. But it was, and I share this and being vulnerable in that I was a person who wasn't aware of like the identity first versus the person first. And I remember him saying to me, like, oh gosh, what was it? And I guess I'm like, how would I frame it in terms of person versus identity first? Versus a person in a wheelchair versus a wheelchair user, I think is how he described it to me. And maybe you can help me out, because as somebody who is coming from sort of a majority group in this way, or dominant group, I am also sharing that I am, not the expert, and I have a lot of bias too.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good example. And I think that that's also a really good example for why whenever there's an opportunity to, it's best to ask someone how they would prefer what language they prefer. So I think a lot, and Brianna, jump in at any point, but I think a lot of different, in particular language, so different kind of disability communities often prefer different language. So the autistic community likes to be, the autistic community, not people with autism most generally, and there's certainly differences to that. Whereas, or the deaf community, right? Capital D, deaf is a community. A lot of times for folks who use wheelchairs, it's like wheelchair bound or stuck in a wheelchair, right? So some of that language can get really negative and like you're stuck or you're, confined to this tool. So a lot of folks I know like to use wheelchair user. So I think, and I don't think there's one answer, but I think in general, just being aware that there are different ways that people like to use language is important. A lot of times, in particular, schools of education teach you only use person first language. And then sometimes that is in opposition to how someone identifies. And I've heard teachers or other professionals say, don't you know you're supposed to use person first language? You're using negative language about, like I've heard sort of outside perspectives, right? Kind of trying to tell someone how they should talk about or identify themselves. And I think that that's where it gets really dangerous personally. Brianna, do you want to jump in at all?
I had a comment. It's Eileen. One of the things that I heard that was really simple for me that somebody said to me, there's a big difference between what you are and what you use. So if you say I'm a person who uses a wheelchair rather than I'm a person who's in a wheelchair or a person who is wheelchair bound or something like that, they said, I want you to talk about what I use, not what I am. It was a distinction that helped me.
Yeah, and some people certainly feel that way. Some people also identify as like, I am disabled, and so like they feel like their chair and kind of all of that is part of their identity. And so I think that that's where the individual ways of thinking about it and choosing are really important.
Linda made a comment that I think is insightful, and says language choices for person first versus identity first seem similar to asking what pronouns folks prefer. and it really is. It's about identity, right? So great insight there. Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you all for that. That's really important conversation. Before we open it up for questions, I wanted to just circle back to the Brianna's last point about disability is not a standalone category, and sort of an example that we were thinking about. I was recently talking with teachers about students who exhibit challenging behavior and sort of this idea of a behavioral emotional disturbance sort of room in a school. And so this teacher was talking about how all the students who have behavior problems go to this particular space to get the supports that they need. And I said, oh, okay. So you mentioned that your school primarily serves Latinx students. So, you know, would that be representative of who is in that space? And she said, actually, now that you mention it, they're all Black boys. And so sort of these larger pieces of identity were not even part of what she was thinking about, because in her mind, she had kind of labeled them as students with behavior disabilities in this separate space. And so all other components of their identity were not something that needed to be named or acknowledged or talked about. Was that what you wanted me to add, Brianna?
Yeah, because she associated it all with disability, where when asked, it was actually not about disability, because some didn't even have a label of disability, right? Some, it was about, in that instance, being a Black boy, not about disability, but it all got lumped in with disability.
Absolutely. Okay, we know there's just a little bit of time left. We wanted to leave some space for questions, comments, and thoughts. I want to go back to the chat to Hannah. So Hannah had asked, would an integrated preschool be an example of a non-segregated space, or is it ableist language? Brianna, do you want to answer that one? Do you want me to?
You?
Okay. So oftentimes, and this is just my perspective, but oftentimes we create these integrated spaces, right? By needing to name them as integrated, we're already signifying something. So it doesn't just create a space where everyone belongs, right? We're naming it as this is a space where including students with disabilities are able to attend. So oftentimes I think integrated spaces are obviously a major step up from segregated spaces, but kind of in the creation of not just creating a preschool that all students can attend, but having to name it and kind of talk about it as integrated still is signifying it as separate and different in some way. That's my perspective. Brianna, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, in thinking about it, it depends, I guess, on the context of how you're explaining it and why. But in general, right, anytime you're still signifying that it's different from something else because you're including people with disabilities, it's something to think about, right? There's never one thing that's always right or wrong in a situation. So it's about thinking about language and why am I saying this way? What is the thinking behind it? And really unpacking that piece of it is important. Because language has to change depending on context, but it's about unpacking your own reasoning behind using specific language.
Yeah, I think we have another hand raised, Nicole.
I was going to say too, just to think about integrated does not necessarily mean included or inclusion. Inclusion is more of a philosophy and a feeling than it is like to be able to say included.
Absolutely. That's an important distinction. Thank you for adding that.
Can I add one thing about that too, please?
Oh, of course.
I taught preschool for years, and I did find, back to your earlier point, it was the only, like an integrated preschool was the only place where you could get teachers that were trained in multiple areas to assist all kids. So in my preschool program, we didn't necessarily have the training. So when I tried to recommend, I was just a part-day program, I tried to recommend some of my students to go to the integrated preschool just so that they could get more of what they needed before kindergarten. If they didn't qualify, they didn't meet the qualifiers, they didn't get it. And so that just added on like another year of them having to wait until they got to the public school because they didn't meet the requirements because it's not available for everybody. So thank you for bringing that point up. It's very close to my heart. Thank you.
Thank you for adding that. Yeah, the ways in which we have to qualify through deficits to get the supports that we need, right, is so problematic. Thank you. Saw a hand from Jennifer, I believe.
Yes, just going to echo what you said. I teach my students about in the Rehabilitation and Disability Studies program. I teach about this, and that was one of the things I taught them was the terms that we use. Sometimes they are ableist and problematic, but if that is how they are defined in regard to getting government funding and government resources, then we are kind of stuck in this conundrum of we can't just go changing the term because then people will lose their resources. And so I teach them about, so think about how far reaching this battle is. It's not just at us at this, macro level and micro level of just changing terms and how we talk about it. You got to think about how far to take the fight. And that's the big thing, the people in power. And so then it's who are those people in power? And then what happens as you push against those people, quote, in power, and how we have to get terms changed at that level. And so I even taught them recently about how the word retarded, they were like, I cannot believe people said this word. And I told them, but that was medically listed and that was how people got funding. If that word was not listed for a diagnosis, they weren't getting the resources. And so we had to think about how long it took to change that, how long it took for that term to be unacceptable and to then, oh, well, there's a different term we can use and we can still apply funding. Yes, we can change the term and still give these individuals the resources they need. But it's so much bigger than just at this level. And this is helpful, but there's so much work to be done at the higher levels.
Agree 1000%. The whole structure needs a major reimagination. There was another hand up, maybe from Linda.
Yeah, I just wanted to share a personal story. My nephew has cerebral palsy, and he has worked as a bagger at a grocery store for over 10 years. And it wasn't until recently that I assumed that he was getting little pay raises along the way because he's been doing it for so long, and found out that he's not only being paid a lower wage, he never gets an increase. And I'm like, what? And I didn't even know that. And also he has a driver's license and the ability to drive a car. He does have a speech impediment and some physical impediments. But in any event, he got stopped by a police officer, and as soon as they heard him talk, they right away were like, what are you doing driving? And so forth and so on. And it was a big mess. And it was a classic example of just an assumption that someone would make as soon as they hear the words out of someone's mouth, like, you can't be driving a car, you can't talk. So just wanted to share those, because as you were going through the list of things, those two examples came to mind. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, the ways in which communication gets kind of lumped with notions of competence and ability is a whole, and that could be a whole nother ginormous conversation, but the assumptions that get made based off of how people communicate, and sometimes really dangerous assumptions that can also lead to really dangerous interactions with police or other structures, is also a whole nother conversation. I think we are about at time. Thank you all so much for joining. It was so nice to spend this chunk of the afternoon with you. We have all sorts of resources we'd be happy to share. If anyone thought of something, was like, I'd love to know more about that. We know it was all pretty brief and super surface level. So feel free to reach out if we can continue the conversation or share resources in any way. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Brianna, for taking the time to share this important information with us, and also for being vulnerable and taking risk and sharing your stories.
Thank you so much for allowing us to be a part of this.
Yes, thank you both so much. This was a great session. I would love to, share some of these resources with the students that we work with and kind of beyond. So thank you for taking the time. It was really helpful for me too, personally. And I hope that you get to enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
Thank you. Same to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.